Okay, there's a hand just here, and then there's a hand, there's a gentleman at the back there. But this lady just here, second row. Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Jo Fells. I work for the Arts Catalyst, which is the science art agency. So my concern is entirely about scientists and artists working together. And I have to say, Mark, congratulations. I think you've summed up the best I've ever heard a way of how scientists do benefit from working with artists. Succinctly, to the point, and with a bit of humour. And I have to say, I think that that's one of the things that is often out of this whole debate, is this idea of flexibility in how we interpret the world. Looking at the world through artists' eyes when you're a scientist can bring the opportunity to look at new questions. And for a scientist who is often about asking questions, having that artist stimulate some new discussion and some new thought. The work I've seen over the last few years has been inspiring because of that. But the idea of publicity, and I say this as a person whose background, unlike most in here, is marketing, the idea of publicity from that relationship is also extremely strong. And by taking something out of the context of a laboratory or a scientific experiment and into the hands of an artist can in fact inspire people from young children up to anybody who maybe has never considered themselves interested in science to think about scientific concepts that affect their lives. So I think there's an enormous capacity for us all, be us artists, scientists or neither, to really get inspiration and look at our world and think differently because of this collaboration.
Thanks very much. Person in front, just here. Yep, then I'll come on to this side in a second.
I'm Brian Butterworth. I'm from the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. And it seems to me that there's something that no one's really talked about, which I think is quite important, which is the content of the science. And for Marina mentioned this in passing, that you have neuroscientists looking at dancers. So one of the interesting questions is what goes on for a neuroscientist in the brain of somebody looking at somebody dancing or doing dance themselves. So there are questions that are raised about neuroscience that actually comes directly from the art. I happen to work, among other things, on music. So the question is, what is it about the brain that makes some things sound nice, that makes, for example, high notes seem higher in space and low notes seem lower in space, low notes being more to the left and high notes being more to the right? Why should that be the case? So there's content that actually inspires scientists to look at new problems. And this isn't new with neuroscience. If you think about, for example, Freud looked at the Greek myths. These were artistic works, and they were part of his inspiration for his theories about the human mind. You look at modern research on memory. They read these memory researchers read Proust. They read other works of art, Wilkie Collins. I won't give away the plot. Where memory is a key element in the way in which the story resolves. So there's content which scientists get from art. And if I may just say one other brief thing, which is about astronomy. When you show pictures of the universe, or galaxies colliding, you don't just take whatever comes out of the computer. You choose the one which has a certain kind of aesthetic value. And that's inspired, perhaps, by the way in which artists have portrayed the world in the past. So I think that presentation of your work is also something that scientists get from artists.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Please respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very good point. I think one of the things, that last point you made was interesting because one of our staff went and visited a lot of departments around UCL, and one of them was astrophysics. And he actually asked how he got this image of a planet or something beyond known time, because he interpreted it through just data, numbers or whatever. And he'd created a picture of it, and he said, well, how did you get that picture? And it was the same as science fiction. In the 50s, he had just created a picture of what it might look like, but entirely from his own imagination, not from interpreting the data to a certain extent, but it was an aesthetic judgment of what it might look like, although the data was actually giving him a lot of clues. But also, I think one of the things which I think has really happened recently is there's been a lot of aspirational attempts to link science and art here and other institutions, but I think it's now becoming viable to link them. There's some real projects are beginning to develop, rather than wouldn't it be interesting or wouldn't it be nice to do something together. So I think that's something which I think has changed relatively recently. And there's been some pioneering projects that have made that possible. But that shift from the aspirational to the viable is something which I think is really an interesting progression. And it is to do with methods as well. Methodologies are becoming more linked up in some way, a better understanding of the methodologies you need to have, the information you need to have to do something, and how that overlaps. So I think we're in a good open phase at the moment.
Thank you. And Mark, I think, what's your...
Well, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that was a very good point on the astronomy thing, I mean, I think this is true across most of physics, that a lot of physics, particularly in astronomy, is very abstract. You're dealing with abstract concepts which you can't visualize, and ultimately the astronomy data is a bunch of intensities and wavelengths, and the data I receive is a bunch of numbers out of a piece of digital electronics. And you often get asked the question, so what is the leap of faith that you go, you know what's inside a proton when all you've seen is a bunch of binary numbers coming out of a piece of electronics? And so there is the scientific method obviously comes into there, and you have to convince yourself that what you see is reproducible and defensible. But then in terms of visualizing it and displaying it, that is very much, it's an open game really, and people have different preferences. I know people who have had 6 hours debates about displaying LHC events and whether the muon chamber should be coloured blue in the display or green, and people have got quite religious about the debate, and again it comes down to aesthetics.
Thank you. Marina.
Just one point about the question of visualization. In fact, you've used it whilst you were talking, and what I was going to say is that there is a difference between illustrating and visualizing. We are both in the business of visualizing, and visualizing is crucial in order to continue with the creative impact. And also the point about content. What to do with the content that you then get is what I was trying to illustrate with the problems that we're encountering at the moment. Because yes, you've got that information. You know what bits of the brain light up when a choreographer or when a dancer is moving in a certain way, which are different from somebody who is not trained as a dancer. But what do you do with that piece of information, particularly as a choreographer, which is what then engages the whole process. So the process is very important. And what I always say is that it's a long process, and we've got to do it very carefully.
Okay, thank you. I just need to...
If you or John had something to say about, for example, medical illustration or zoological illustration, the impact that
Huge,
has actually
yeah.
on the science.
Enormous. And what Golgi did by illustrating, and Ramon y Cajal, what they did by illustrating, is what inspired us, and it was crucial to have that visualization of the ganglia.